why don't we get started, I guess. It's almost 9:15, so don't want to keep you waiting in bated breath for too long. It's loud. Kelly might be coming in, maybe.
I didn't see her somewhere.
She's here. She's here somewhere. She's probably just dropping off the kids. But all right. So this is where we left off last week, or 2 weeks ago, rather. We kind of did some challenges. We're still on Columbo number 2. So quick rehash. What's Columbo number 1? Anybody remember? Reaching back to our memory. What do you? There we go, Dale. What do you mean by that, right? So that's our first question that we want to use when someone makes a challenge against us. So if someone, just the example that I've been using, since the beginning of the class, just so I don't, because I want you guys to come up with some examples on your own at some point, so I don't want to steal all your good examples. So I'm just going to give the same one the entire class. Christians are a bunch of science deniers, right? So let's just say that challenge comes your way. You're going to want to first ask, what do you mean by that, right? So what do you mean by science denier? And then they'll say something like, well, you don't accept scientific facts. That'll be there. What do you mean? And then you can say, well, then you're going to use Columbo number 2. Anyone remember Columbo number 2? This would have been what we've been doing in the past. This is last class. How'd you come to that conclusion, right? So those are just those 2 questions. If you learn anything from this class, those are the 2 that you're going to want to remember because they require 0 skill, right? So anytime you end up in a conversation, if you remember Columbo number 1, what do you mean by that? And Columbo number 2, how'd you come to that conclusion? You can actually make a lot of headway in your discussions with people, especially if you get challenged and you're kind of not expecting it. You don't feel like you have to be some PhD apologist or whatever. If you just know those 2 questions, you can really get pretty far. And so last week or 2 weeks ago, what we did was we kind of practiced using specifically Columbo number 2, and we kind of all came up with our own challenge. So that was kind of what we did 2 weeks ago, and yeah, we kind of had a lot of fun doing that. And what the point of this class is to really make it more of a practical class where we learn some information, right? We learn what these tactics are, but then we also engage with each other in these discussions, kind of mock discussions, role playing type thing, because that way when we get out into the world and it's the real thing, we're prepared for it in some way. And we're only going to have so many of these opportunities. So I like to do that as much as I can. Today's probably going to be more of a bit of an informational session. We're going to go through some fun things, though, too. We're going to look into, Jesus using Columbo, so it kind of can show us that there's actually model for this in the Bible, which is kind of a neat thing. Before we do that, we're going to talk about narrating the debate. So let's say you get into a discussion, right, and you use your Columbo number 1 and Columbo number 2, right? Come on in, Ryan. So, and Carolyn. So let's just kind of go with the same example that I had earlier, right? Christians are a bunch of science deniers, and then they say, well, you don't accept scientific facts. Then you ask, well, how'd you come to that conclusion? Then they'll say, well, you don't accept evolution, right? And then at that point, you're going to say, well, I didn't know that evolution was a scientific fact. Can you explain to me how it went from being a theory to a scientific fact? And at that point, they might not really have a good explanation because it's not a scientific fact. It's a theory still. And so they're not really going to be able to give you good evidence for that. And what you might find is that they're flat-footed, right? They just kind of don't really have a response. A couple weeks ago, we kind of talked about a situation of someone just not responding to you at all. I find that to be very unlikely in personal interactions. They're more likely to try to change the subject, right? In a way to save face, right? It would just be very socially awkward to just stop talking to someone. In fact, when I was giving that talk, I was like, I can't really imagine this happening, but let's just say someone just stops talking to you. This is what you would do. But what they're more likely to do is to just try to change the subject and redirect the conversation. And so when that happens, this is what you want to do, is narrate the debate. Right, so let's just kind of bring all these points so I make sure I don't forget to cover any of them. Okay, so narrating the debate is where you notice that you get off topic. And so let's just kind of go back to that example I was giving earlier with Christians are a bunch of science deniers. You ask them how did evolution go from being a theory to a scientific fact? They don't really have a good explanation for that. And so they say, well, I can't believe that you believe in miracles, right? And so obviously they changed the subject there. We were talking about the theory of evolution and how it's a scientific fact or not, and then they just completely changed it to miracles. not that the two, maybe there might be some loose connections there, but you want to then narrate the debate. Say like, well, we were talking about evolution, and I kind of asked you, how did it go from being a theory to a fact? And we've suddenly started talking about miracles. Can we just stick on the subject of evolution for now and try to determine how it's a fact and what your evidence is for that it's a fact, and then we can move on to how it became, or miracles. We can talk about that later. And what this does is that it helps your friend and your listeners, right? So friend, sometimes this might be a hostile discussion, so friend might be the wrong word to use there. But let's just hope that it's just a cordial discussion between you and someone who is well-meaning. So it helps your friend and your listeners to see where you got off course. Now, more than likely, the person that you're debating with, it was at least intentional, even if it was on a subconscious level. They just didn't know the answer, and so they just kind of redirected. But it just helps at least the listeners, because sometimes this might be happening in an area where you're being challenged in an area where there's other people that might also be curious to know, like, what is the evidence for the Christian faith, or what's the evidence for evolution, and it kind of helps them to hear, oh wait, this guy didn't really give a good response to that evolution question. That's weird, because in their minds they might think that there actually is a lot of evidence for evolution, but when he doesn't give a good response, then it might kind of, well, maybe I should research this a little bit, and it kind of sows those little seeds of doubt in their mind about a lot of the theories that are being thrown around in some of the liberal institutions today. So, so that's kind of like a useful tool to, so it's often the first step towards a change of mind, right? So they probably aren't even aware. A lot of times these people aren't aware that evolution is not really a scientific fact. It's something that's just kind of been accepted into the cultural zeitgeist without any real reflective thought on it. And so this kind of helps them to change their mind, because they didn't really even consider that it might not be true. So, any questions on narrating the debate, or kind of the utility of it? No? Pretty good? Okay. Staying out of the hot seat. So these are all like little mini tactics that we can use with our Columbo number 2 tactic, which we're still kind of in the what do you mean by that session. And so all of us need this tactic at some point, right? No one knows everything, and we're all going to be, challenged in some way, and it's just it could be an aggressive critic, right? That's just kind of, just piling on challenge after challenge after challenge, and we don't know how to deal with them. Firstly, because there's so many of them, and secondly, because we might not have heard some of these challenges before. They might be new to us. And so, don't feel like you have to be, a hero and everything, because no one does. And so what you do in those situations is you kind of just very humbly ask them to slow the pace down, right? So, you're kind of like giving me some of this information that's new to me, and it's coming really fast. So can we just slow the pace down a little bit and try to just take it in piecemeal? So just like one by one, just whatever challenge you have. I really want to make sure I understand what you're saying to me, so that I can adequately respond to you, and it's not just like I'm not just screaming back at you, right? And it helps to, again, keep the conversation friendly while showing the other person that you do genuinely care about what they're saying. So. But most importantly, it's helping you to gather information still. So these first 2 tactics, Columbo number 1, what do you mean by that? And Columbo number 2, how'd you come to that conclusion? It's primarily about gathering information. The first one is gathering information about their view, making sure that you fully understand their view. The second one is about gathering information about their rationale. How did they come to that view? What was the process that they used in order to come to that understanding? And so the more fully you understand those 2 things, the better you are going to be at being able to kind of identifying the flaws of their view and then moving forward with the conversation. So so that's what you're gonna switch into fact-finding mode. So you're just gonna start using your Columbo number 1 and 2 like crazy. You're just gonna say, okay, well, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? Just whatever subject you're talking about. Absorb as much information as you can, and then you're gonna say the magic words, which is, okay, now let me think about it. Because maybe you'll come up with you'll identify some flaws, over the course of, uncovering all of that information. But you might not really know how to connect the dots at that point. A lot of times we don't work very well in these kind of more adrenaline-induced discussions, right? It's kind of like, heat of the moment type thing. We don't think as clearly. We're oftentimes functioning at like 50% in those moments. And so what we do when we do this, when we say, okay, now let me think about it, we're taking ourselves out of that hot seat. And now we're able to contemplate on it when we go home. We can research, right, on the internet, see if there is a good response to it. We can, incorporate help from our friends that might know a little bit more about the subject, or a pastor or whoever, so that we can, have a good response to a challenge that we might not have heard before. Or even if we have heard it before, we go home, we kind of, synthesize our own response to it. We can kind of, okay, if someone asks me this question, this is how I'm gonna respond to it. And as we get better at that, it'll kind of be right there waiting for us when we're in these discussions. But if it's our first time encountering it, we might know the answer. It's just not there, at the tip of our brain at that particular moment. So now you can work on the issue later when the pressure is off. Any questions on staying out of the hot seat? It's kind of a very useful little tactic, and don't feel like you're sacrificing. You're like a bad representative for Christ if you don't know the answer to something. Like I said, all of us have this situation arise, and certainly even the person that's challenging you, if they were honest, would probably like to use this question at some point. So, make sense? Cool. Verbal Aikido. It's basically just another way of saying the tactic that we just mentioned. Is just kind of another way of staying out of the another way of envisioning staying out of the hot seat, or as another metaphor for it. Nope, don't go back yet. It's just kind of the image I have for this is and I guess it's similar to the picture going on here. Anyone see The Matrix, the movie The Matrix? Yeah, no, maybe. There's this very famous scene where the agents are firing bullets at Neo, and he dodges them, right? And that's what verbal Aikido is. So they're making an advance towards you, and you're just kind of dodging their bullets you're not necessarily saying that they're right, but you're asking more questions on them. And what this does, though, this definitely shifts the control back to you. Every time, if you're asking questions, you're the one that's guiding the conversation. And so especially if there's a direction that you want to go with that conversation, if you know there's a flaw somewhere, then you can guide the conversation to that flaw and then eventually ask a question about that flaw itself. And that's actually going to be incorporating I don't know if we're going to get to it today, but Columbo number 3. Columbo number 3 is using questions to make a point. What's so cool about that pretty much will finish our Columbo series. What's so cool about Columbo number 1, 2, and 3 is you can make a case for Christianity without ever making an assertion, which is a huge advantage, because if you're not, anyone remember the burden of proof rule? Right. Yeah. So if you're the one making the claim, if you're the one making the accusation, you now have to provide evidence. Now, if you're asking questions the whole time, you never have to prove anything. And so you can actually make your case without ever bearing the burden of proof. And that's really the magic of using these Columbo questions. And the third one takes a little bit of skill, it takes a little bit of insight and background knowledge, but with practice and with some study, you can get pretty good at it. So Jesus in Columbo. So this is we're going to spend some time on this, more because it's fun. It's really just kind of a side note in the book, but I thought it would be a good time for us to just really see how Jesus used Columbo in the Bible. And most of them are Columbo number 3s, right? So they're using questions to make a point, and I'm going to kind of show you what that looks like, in these different examples. So let's kind of bring them up. So I've got a total of 7 of them. So whose image is on this? So this is from Luke 20:24. And what the context of the situation is when Jesus was challenged, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Okay, and so when Jesus asked this question, he says, okay, well, show me a denarius. And so they bring out a coin, and he asks, whose image is on this? And so what this question is doing, so they asked him, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, this is obviously a trap, right? And it even says that in the text, that they wanted to trap him in his words, because if he says that we shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, well, we know that's going to get him in trouble with who? Rome, right? So, and then if he says that if we should pay taxes to Caesar, well, that gets him in trouble with the Jews, because they don't want to, they're being blood drained from all these taxes, and it was a real problem for the Jewish people at this time. And so someone was gonna be angry at him for this. And so what he does is he definitely shifts the burden of proof onto the Pharisees, right? He says, whose image is on this? Now they're forced to say it's Caesar's face that's on that. And so then he just says, okay, well, by your own conclusion, then we should give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God. And so he stays out of the hot seat that way by taking the burden of proof off of himself and putting it onto the Pharisees. John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin? Now, context for this is Luke 24. So the context for this is the Pharisees are going up to Jesus, and they want to know where he gets his authority from. And so Jesus says, okay, I'll make you a deal. If you answer my question, I will answer your question. And so they were, okay, fair enough. And so we asked John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin? Now, Jesus, similar to the Pharisees, knowing in the previous one that they're really putting Jesus in a tough spot, because if he says one way or the other, he's going to get in trouble with someone. Same thing that Jesus is doing back to them with this one. If they say that John's baptism was from heaven, well, then they look like total hypocrites, because they didn't accept John's baptism was from heaven, and that was pretty obvious. So they knew they couldn't say that one. And then if they said it was of human origin, then they were going to get in trouble with the Jewish people who accepted that John was a prophet. And so either way, the Pharisees are in trouble, and so they know they couldn't respond to it, and so they say, we don't know. And then Jesus is like, well, I don't know either. Well, he didn't say I don't know either. He says, I won't respond to you either. He knows very well where he gets his authority from. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? So this one comes in the context of him being challenged for performing miracles, performing good deeds on the Sabbath, right? This is something that Jesus did on a rather frequent basis. At least that's how it looks from the gospel writings. And they were essentially calling him a sinner for doing this. And so this is kind of more of a rhetorical question, because is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? He follows that up with, if a child were to fall into a ditch on the Sabbath, would you not pull him out, right? And so everyone knows that they would have pulled their child out on the Sabbath. I think there's another place in the Gospels where it's even heightened, where he says, if a donkey were to fall into a ditch on the Sabbath, would you not pull it out? And so how much more valuable is a human life, someone who's been paralyzed for 40 years, and you kind of heal them, than a donkey who falls into a ditch, right? So the obvious answer to that is that it's the human being that's been suffering for 40 years, or however long they've been suffering for. And so the bottom line is that they're forced to come to their own conclusion that it's good to do good on the Sabbath, right? So using questions to make a point. So any questions on those, or any insights on those that anyone wants to share? Or, this isn't just a Mike show. So,
These were comments that Jesus made.
Right.
This is off topic.
That's fine.
Was Jesus omniscient, like we think God is?
Right.
Was he omnipresent, like we think God is? I'm just saying, he had a real distinct idea.
Sure. Yes, there is that. So, there's always going to be that difference between us and Jesus, where Jesus, always has the advantage, and so he always knows how this is going to go. He knows what the Pharisees are thinking in all these moments. But I guess it doesn't mean that we couldn't, model at least the question format.
I agree.
Okay. Yeah, but no, Dale is right. Jesus has an advantage over us. So.
I think the harder part, for me personally, thinking about this, and maybe it's because in those situations, I just don't think very well, personally.
I don't either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm being honest. For me to think I should answer that question with a question, when someone's firing at me, for me to not just answer the question and say, well, whose image is on? I know myself. I know I should work at that probably, but
it's just not a reflex.
I would just be like, well, you should pay your tax to, you know what I mean?
Right.
Not whose image is on this. That would never cross my mind.
I know.
How do you get there?
I know, and I actually think back, so Carolyn said it was the first couple classes that we said that we're retraining our brain. You said that, right? Remember that? You did say that. And that's what this class is, right? We're really retraining our brain. That's why I think we want to focus on those practice moments when we're kind of engaging with each other to try to just change those habits that we have. Because you're right, I have the same habit. When someone makes a challenge against me, I want to give them my evidence, right? But it's not my job if I didn't make the claim. And just getting that into my head is so hard because I have to overcome this habitual reflex that I have to just like defend myself. And so defending yourself with questions is very counterintuitive. I will totally agree. So, all right. So let's move on to, we've got 4 more. All right. So this is actually the one exception where Jesus is not engaging with the Pharisees in number 4, where he's saying, how can the Messiah be David's son if David calls him Lord? So in this one, he's just addressing the crowd. By the way, Carolyn, if you happen to notice that I'm wrong in anything that I say, because I see you're looking in the Bible, so please correct me. But I'm just more going on faith that I looked it up when I was originally creating this. So how can the Messiah be David's son if David calls him Lord? So he's speaking to the crowd, but he's referring to what the Pharisees say. So the Pharisees do say, they affirm that the Messiah is David's son. That was something that they had accurate perception about based on certain messianic prophecies. However, what they were mistaken on was that they didn't accept that the Messiah was God. Right? That wasn't the Jewish understanding of the Messiah at that time, nor is it today, I believe. So Jesus asked this question, well, how can the Messiah be David's son if David calls him Lord? And that would have been really upside down thinking for them at this time. How can the Lord of David also be his son? And it just didn't make sense to them. And the way that he did that was a reference to Psalm 110. So in Psalm 110 it says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet, which is a messianic verse. And so they didn't know how to respond to that, because how do you have this one messianic verse where David was calling the Messiah Lord, but then there's other ones where it says that he's his son. And of course, Jesus knows the answer to that because he is the Lord over David, because he is God. But the Pharisees didn't know how to deal with that question, and so the crowd just cheered. I think that's all it says, is that they marveled at Jesus' insight. So, which of the 2 sons did what his father wanted? So Matthew 21:31, which is the parable of the 2 sons. And so in this one, we have a father who has 2 sons, and he asked his first son, I don't know if he's older or younger, but to go and tend to the fields or to go and do work. And the son says, sure, and then he doesn't do it. And then the second one says, no, and then he does do it, right? Am I right in the order with that? Okay, good. I wasn't sure if I got him out of order, but the basic story is accurate, I think. And so the first son. So then he asks, which of the sons did the will of the Father? And the Pharisees say, well, the second one. And so again, putting the burden of proof onto the Pharisees, he's making the Pharisees concede the point that it was the older son, the one that didn't do the will of the Father at first, but then ultimately did do it, that did do the will of the Father, not the one who said he would and then didn't, right? And then the correlation here, the parallel that they're supposed to draw, the conclusion that they're supposed to come to based on that parable is that the Pharisees are saying that we are doing the will of the Lord. We are following the law. We are doing everything that he wants us to do, but then they reject his very son. Right? So they don't do the will of the Father in the end. Whereas you have tax collectors and prostitutes saying, I'm not going to do the will of the Father, I'm going to sin as much as I want, and then his son comes and they accept him. Right? So that's the obvious conclusion that they're supposed to come to. But he's using questions. He never forces it upon the Pharisees. When he's making these questions, he's having them draw their own conclusions based on their own statements that they're making in response to the parables. Right?
It's a better way to learn and understand something, actually, is you have to mull over a question rather than being force-fed answers.
Right, because they have to think about it.
You actually have to think about it, and you got to wrestle through, what do I actually think about this?
Right. That's very true. So here's another one. So if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me? So that's in John 18:23. And the context of this one is when Jesus is on trial. So he's on trial, and the Sanhedrin's kind of asking him, well, what are your teachings, basically? And Jesus kind of, briefly responds that, I haven't been preaching under a rock. I've been in the synagogues, preaching. I've been on the streets preaching. And so, why are you asking these questions, basically? And so then they slap him. Because, and they say, well, how dare you address the high priest in this way? And Jesus says, well, if I've said something wrong, then testify to the wrong. But if I've spoken the truth, then why do you strike me? And so he's kind of putting the onus back on them to actually tell what is the wrong thing that he said. And they never do. They just kind of take him off to be before Pilate. So he puts the burden of proof back onto them, and they don't really have, good evidence. So, which of the indebted men will love him more? This is from Luke 7:42. This one has a bit more context. So this is a conversation that Jesus is having with Simon the Pharisee. And during this discussion with Simon the Pharisee, he's at Simon's home, and a woman comes in who's of low repute, assumingly she's a prostitute or something, and she starts to bathe his feet in perfume and is crying over his feet and washing his feet with her tears. And in Simon's mind, in the Pharisee's mind, he's thinking if Jesus knew who this woman was, he wouldn't be allowing her to do this. So if he was a prophet, then he would actually know. And Jesus says, Simon, I have something to tell you. And Simon then says, please tell. And he tells him a parable of a man with a moneylender with two people that were indebted to him. One owed him 50 denarii, another owed him 500 denarii. So denarii is a day's wage. So obviously, if someone owes you 500 denarii, that's a lot of money. And he says he canceled the debt of both. And then he asked Simon the Pharisee which one loved him more after he canceled the debt. And so the conclusion he was forced to draw, and he accurately said, was the one who owed him more. And so, again, similarly to the one we were talking about earlier with which of the two sons did what the father wanted, he's making the Pharisee agree that, that the one who owed him more would love him more. And then he draws the parallel, he makes the corollary to his current situation. There's this woman who is indebted to God beyond belief with whatever sins that she's committed, and she's obviously pouring, it's very expensive perfume on his feet and is just in this state of grief and just love for Jesus, whereas Simon doesn't even offer him a snack, right? So it's very obvious that it was the woman who loved him far more than Simon the Pharisee. It was really an encouragement to Simon the Pharisee to, love him more, I guess. But that was the conclusion he was to draw from that question. So I think it's just very encouraging for me to see, Jesus even using these kind of Columbo type questions where you're using questions to make a point. And I think it's something that we can really use in our own lives as a model to see that really our Lord, used them too. So I figured I'd point that out. But here we go. Let's change gears a little bit. So you're such an intolerant bigot. All right. So, we covered this subject a little bit in my last class, but never a problem to rehash it. So, if you suspect that your views will be labeled as intolerant, you want to turn the tables on them, before the conversation even gets started. And I think we all know, that there are certain people that might be hostile to our views without even necessarily having had a conversation with them. You kind of know what their views are ahead of time, and so you don't necessarily have to say anything mean to them, but before you even get into the conversation, just ask, are you a tolerant person? Do you respect diverse views, or do you condemn others for their different views? One of my favorite ones, kind of the bottom one, because it's using emotionally charged language against the person. So is it safe to give my opinion, or will you judge me for my point of view? Right? Yeah, I don't know that I would either, but I think it's funny. The idea of using it's kind of funny. But what specifically with that bottom one, what's kind of good about it in a way, a lot of times people use emotional language against us. And so you can use that emotional language against them too, because they hate the idea of judging, right? This idea of judging is like a no-go. You are never supposed to do that with certain people. Again, if you understand the concept of judgment, you understand there's this justice aspect to it. When you really parse it out, there's really nothing wrong with judging. You can judge correctly or incorrectly. But there's certain people that really hold this belief that judging is an absolute moral wrong. And so you kind of say, when you put it in this way, will you judge me for my point of view? You're putting them in a position where they cannot say yes. They have to say no. And so then when you say your view, this is usually going to happen in a controversial setting, right? So if we're talking about homosexuality or abortion, that's when these kinds of accusations tend to fly, that you're an intolerant bigot. So if you say, well, I do believe that the Bible teaches that, homosexuality is a sin, and their gut reaction is going to be to call you an intolerant bigot at that moment. But if they do, they might as well just turn that charge against themselves too, because they're calling you they're being intolerant of your view, while they're calling you that. So it really shows that there's no neutral ground in these kinds of discussions. So it's just kind of a tactful way to kind of turn those tables in those kinds of heated moments where you really do feel like someone is going to label your views, which are merely just biblical views. Right? These aren't necessarily political views; they are just biblical views, and it kind of just reverses that a little bit.
Sounds like a good conversation or a good question for teenagers as well.
Sure. You want to give me, how do you mean that?
I mean, because there are times that my children, I think, will have a different opinion than I do.
Uh-huh.
Things that matter.
Uh-huh.
That could be, they would be good to practice on.
There you go. Yeah, you can use that bottom one too, right? On your kids. Oh, that's funny.
So we just, I mean, I think we have to just have that one way in our lives for a little bit of time. But
There you go. Well, I'll leave it up on YouTube, so you'll have it.
somebody said that. We went there at 18.
There you go. It's hard to imagine little Jake like saying something that would really cause that, but I'm sure you're his parents. I'm sure you know better than I do.
They have a lot more words at home than they
Yes, I'm sure they do.
It's not, it's the little one that we're looking at.
Oh well.
The little one has the most opinion. The little one has the most opinion.
That's funny. Okay, so you might need to stow us away for a few more years then. All right, very good. All right. So, any questions on being an intolerant bigot? No.
I was just saying to her,
Uh-huh.
the last bullet point shows that there's no neutral ground in these kinds of discussions. Perhaps that's the reason we stay away from discussions, because that is neutral ground. What do you say? You know what I'm saying? You don't get in trouble.
Right. Well, so when you say because there's no, yeah, right, because there's no neutral ground, we can get in trouble with people. Is basically what you're saying, right?
You stay neutral if you don't engage in discussions.
Right. That's right. So since it's the hostility will fly one way or another.
Right.
You know, and it's still safe, and everybody carries on with no having to challenge to your thoughts.
Yeah, unfortunately, though, this philosophy will take over if all Christians never engage it. And so that's something that we need to remember is that we are called, biblically, we are called to be ambassadors for Christ and to make a defense when people ask us for the hope that is within us. And this is a variation of that. When people are making these kind of controversial challenges against us, they're asking, why do you put your stock in this Bible? Right? Why do you think that this Bible is true, but not what the culture is saying? What the highfalutin academics are saying? In Harvard and Yale. And so and it might not seem like it. It's not as direct as someone saying, "Why do you feel like you must be saved by Jesus Christ?" That's the most obvious example of you giving your testimony as to why you have the hope that you do. But even when they ask you questions about this, it's a subtle way of asking that. It's if anything, it's trying to subvert that faith that you have, and so we want to be prepared to even answer those types of questions. But I definitely understand the desire to avoid these kinds of discussions because of the temptation to want to remain neutral at all times. But it comes with a cost, I think, is all I'm trying to say. So, all right. So questions that are not questions. So I don't know if you guys watch Batman Forever, but that's from. All right. So here's a question that's not really a question. So what gives you the right to say someone else's religion is wrong? All right. Now most of us, when we see that, like I think Aubrey's probably like, well, I kind of know what I want to say to that because that's not really a question. That's kind of making an accusation. But so we kind of know the subtext of that. What's the subtext of that question? What are they kind of saying there?
That's being said to us.
Right.
We're responding that way, right?
Right.
I don't understand. I feel like they're saying Christianity is wrong.
That's probably in there, yes.
Like that, like underline, because they're basically, I think they're trying to say you're wrong for your view. I think it's a little more like you don't get to tell anybody what to do. There's that.
Yeah, so and you can see how Katie's follows from that one, though, because Christianity does say that other views are wrong, right? And in fact, all religions do. But what Carolyn said, that is, I think, where Greg was kind of going with this, is that the underlying assertion here is that it's never okay to say that someone else's religion is wrong. It's like no one is ever justified in saying that the truth of another's religion is false. So that's the statement of that. However, let's play dumb. So they're phrasing this as a question. If we were going to respond to this as a question, what would we be saying? What is the, if we're looking at this hyper literally, what is the question?
On what authority do you speak?
Yes. Right. So there's two in there. That's the more basic one, I think. So what gives you? So the right. So where does your authority come from? But it's also talking about rights a little bit there too. Like what right are they referring to? Like, and so you can kind of play dumb a little bit to see if you can flush out that statement that's really underneath that question, right? And so the question being is, it's never okay to challenge another's religion. But you like asking me about like the rights in the Constitution? Where you go? Are you asking me about my credentials? Do I need to have a PhD in biblical theology in order to be able to, declare that someone else's religion is wrong? What exactly are you saying in this statement? Right, and so you kind of ask that. You kind of say that you're a little confused by what they're saying, and then they might rephrase it in the statement form. Because once they make the statement, then you can start to go into your Columbos of like, well, what do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? And so let's just say they don't. Right, let's just say that they just keep reiterating this question. You can then say, well, it seems to me like you're saying that it's never okay to challenge the truth of another's religion. Is that what you're saying? Once they say yes, then you can move into that is their declaration at that point. Now you've identified what they actually think, and you can then say, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that no religions are true, that all religions are true, that it's impossible to know if any religions are true, and then have them clarify, right?
I feel like, somebody asked you this question,
it's all. Right, it's a lot to take in, and then they might choose one. Right, they might say, "Well, I think it's impossible to know." Right? I think a lot of people do feel that way. That we don't know if Islam's true, we don't know if Judaism's true, we don't know if Christianity's true, and so they just say, "Well, we just kind of have to accept all of them." Right, that's kind of the basic assumption that they're making. And then you can just say, "How'd you come to that conclusion? How'd you come to that conclusion that it's impossible to know?" And then that kind of dovetails very nicely, into if you want to kind of talk about the defenses of Christianity, that there is evidence for God, that there is evidence of the resurrection, But again, we're gonna continue to use questions through that process. I think you guys did pretty good with that. So we identified that. Are you saying no one can challenge the truth of another religion? Yeah, so move on to club number 1, number 2. Okay, good. So we got through all that, and then this is our last slide for session number 2, and we might have a tiny bit of time to move on to number 3. This is basically just a recapitulation on staying out of the hot seat, right? So if someone's just being like kind of rapid machine gun fire, always switch into fact-finding mode, and then just remember that you can let me think about that. You can just always bring that back in order to do your homework and understand the objection completely, and then you're prepared the next time you see them. And it just is a very nice way of just reducing your anxiety and increasing your confidence, because the more that you kind of end up in these engagements and you kind of use that kind of default, let me think about it, your knowledge base is increasing, and you're going to be able to defend the faith better. So we only get better through practice. So okay, so that's that, and let's come out of there, and where is 3? Okay. Let's. All right, let's do a quick rehash. What's the burden of proof?
If you make the statement, you have to prove.
Right, yeah.
If burden of proof is on you, or make the statement.
Person making the claim has to bear the burden, right? And that is also the burden of proof rule. I think there's 2 slightly different ways of saying it. So the burden of proof is the responsibility someone has to defend their own view, and then the burden of proof rule is the person who makes the claim bears the burden, right? So what's the second key question of the Columbo tactic? How'd you come to that conclusion? What's Columbo number 1? What do you mean by that, right? So what do you mean by that? It's gathering information, and then Columbo number 2 is understanding their rationale. The professor's ploy. So it's been a little bit since we discussed this one. So anyone remember what the professor's ploy is? Some of you might not have been here on that day. Anyone remember?
I remember they kind of made just a statement. They're kind of in a position of authority and just kind of made an offhand statement.
Mm-hmm.
Giving any evidence. It was just the Bible's a bunch of myths and then trying to move on.
Exactly. Right. And so the ploy is then when the student doesn't challenge them, but asks them, okay, what's your evidence for that the Bible's just a bunch of myths? And then what they do is the actual ploy itself is to then take the burden of proof off of them and put it onto the student and say, all right, so it seems like you're a Christian. It seems like you believe that the Bible is not a bunch of myths. Why don't you just, I'll give you the floor for 2 minutes, and you can, tell the whole world why the Bible is not a bunch of myths and Christianity is true. And of course, what they're doing there is they're inappropriately putting the burden of proof onto the student. The student never made the claim; they just asked the question. And so, what we want to remember is when people do that, when people, make a claim and then, expect us to, account for that claim, that they're putting the burden of proof in the wrong spot. So, and it's a way for them to, keep themselves out of the hot seat, but you just want to keep the pressure on by putting the burden of proof where it's supposed to be, which is on the person who made the claim. Okay. So Columbo number 3, using questions to make a point. So the first 2 questions, the beauty of them is that they require zero knowledge, right? And a lot of those questions or those responses that come along with it, right? So now let me think about it. All of those require zero skill. So all we have to do is just remember them. We just have to remember, what do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? And then if you don't know the answer to something, just say, okay, well now let me think about it after you kind of fully understand their view. The third question requires us to know a little bit of something specific. And so something that we did in the last class, right, we got a ton of information, right? So those of you that weren't in the first class that we did, we kind of learned like a series of defenses for the faith and based on different types of questions that we might get. And so it was kind of building up our knowledge base. And it's that knowledge base that's going to help us with our Columbo number 3 question. Because it's that knowledge that's going to help us to identify the flaws that are being thrown at us from the various challenges that come from, skeptics. And so what we need to know is that we need to know our target point, right? So I think I had an example for this. So if someone says that there can't be a good God with evil, right? Because we have evil in the world, there can't be a good God. Well, if you kind of know the basic apologetics of that, which is that you can't really have goodness or evil without God because there's really no basis for it, right? You need a kind of a transcendent standard in order to have evil actually exist, because otherwise, it's just kind of morality is just floating in midair. It's not actually grounded in anything, because you can say, well, I believe that it's wrong to kill people because it's illegal, right? And it's like, okay, let's say a government made it legal. Is it now okay? And they're going to be tempted to say no, but you're going to have to ask them why. All right, so you know that your target is getting them to see that that they don't have an objective moral standard, and so when they say that that God is that there can't be, because of evil there is no God, right? So when that's their basic premise, you know that you want to get to objective morality, because once you get them to see that without objective morality you don't have morality, which they're going to want to affirm. They're going to want to affirm that racism is wrong, that it's wrong to kill people, innocent people, whatever it is, but they're not going to be able to do it without God. And so you can say, ultimately, how do you have evil without God, right? That would be your target point that you want to get to. And so that's kind of an example of using Columbo number 3. But this really does hinge upon our Columbo number 2 knowledge, right? We're not going to really be able to effectively use Columbo number 3 if we don't understand their view fully. We have to know what their rationale was to coming to their view. We want to know what their view is, and once we have all of that knowledge, then we can start to think about, okay, well, what are the defenses of the faith, and how can I really show the absurdity of this view, or that it really doesn't make sense? It's logically fallacious, and kind of the basic premise is that you're going to address any inconsistency with a question instead of a statement, right? That's kind of the underlying practice of the Columbo tactics. So, anything else I want to get in there? Yeah, I think that's pretty much. Any questions on kind of what Columbo number 3 is? So unfortunately for Columbo number 3, there's not just like a stock question, right? which is why I think Columbo number 1 and 2 are so easy. Is like, okay, what do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? There's infinite variations that are going to come up with Columbo number 3, and so there's really not just a stock question, but there's different ways that you can use it, and we're going to spend pretty much the remainder of this class showing different variations of Columbo number 3. All right, where are we going from here? And do we have time? That's probably a good spot to end, because we're about to head into this is kind of a heavy slide. So we'll get into this next week. Next week? No, not next week. Rise Up with Jesus is next week. So the following week after that. So yes, for those of you that don't know, so we have our family Sunday school program next week. So it's Rise Up with Jesus. So all the kids are going to be doing this kind of like a fun, interactive Easter activity just to help them learn the resurrection. And I will be guiding that. So we won't be having adult Sunday school that day. But you're all welcome to join to see the kids have fun. Up Youth Center. Yep, up at the Youth Center. So but it should be a good time. So and today's Palm Sunday. So and we have the Easter candy sale. So the kids will be selling their Easter candy after the service. So please join us for that. And maybe I'll pray our way out of here, and then we can head up to worship. So thank you, Lord, for bringing us into your house this morning, and just allowing us to learn, just kind of finish up this Columbo number 2. How did you come to that conclusion? And then we got to see examples of you using it in Holy Scripture, and just as an encouragement to show us that really using questions to make a point are an effective way to get people to see your truth. And it's in your blessed name that we pray. Amen.